Got it. Okay, so Swanee, that's the idea. And so if you have ideas, let me know. But I basically celebrate classmates for doing interesting things that we can hear from. So no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Peggy Epstein Tanner, who's going to introduce Bill. And yeah, I think if people can keep their mute off, their sound off, and maybe even their video off, we might get a better signal. But anyway, Peggy, take it over, my friend.
Thank you. And first of all, welcome everyone. I want to offer a bit of an apology. When we scheduled tonight's event, we were not aware that President Biden would be giving his State of the Union. We will do our best to wrap up before the president begins, but I can say with confidence that we are in for a real treat tonight. And I can't think of a greater privilege than hearing from our classmate, Bill Holmes, and learning about his remarkable journey. Bill heeded Robert Frost's advice and took the road less traveled, and President Kennedy's mantra that we are our brother's keeper. Since his days at Dartmouth, when Bill volunteered weekly as a big brother at the Brookhaven Children's Center, he has lived his life putting the needs of others before his own. During his medical residencies, Bill volunteered in refugee camps in Thailand and Cambodia. While working for 5 years as a pediatric plastic surgeon in Oakland, California, Bill spent countless vacation hours treating victims of genocide in remote areas of Africa and Asia. In the early 2000s, Bill sold his truck and his sailboat, his two worldly possessions, gave the proceeds from these sales to the Oakland Children's Hospital and to the Third Monday Foundation, a charity that he and some of his Dartmouth friends founded. Stored his few possessions, mostly documents, in the attics of his brothers and friends, and with his backpack and a medical bag, set off around the globe, helping the most vulnerable among us. Bill has had numerous brushes with death, has contracted serious illnesses, and been in numerous accidents, but he is undeterred and a true force. Prior to one assignment in the Congo, the NGO placing him advised Bill to put his affairs in order. I don't know about the rest of you, but that would have given me pause to reassess my upcoming assignment, but not Bill. In 2018, our classmate Bill Holmes was our class's first recipient of a Dartmouth honorary degree. I can truly not think of a more deserving inductee. Part of Bill's citation read, "With a tremendous sense of altruism, you dedicated your life to traveling the world, often at great personal risk, from one disaster-stricken area to the next, providing direct medical care to victims of war, genocide, poverty, and natural disasters. Cognizant of local customs and respectful of cultural differences, you provided compassionate care to the neediest of patients in every corner of the world." Bill is proficient in 13 languages, and in 2011 published Voices from the Peace Zone, a collection of stories and missives of his experiences in the field. Bill truly epitomizes Dartmouth's adventuresome spirit, and lucky us to call him our classmate. I hope you'll all join me in welcoming Bill. And before he gets started, I encourage you all to ask questions whenever they come to mind. Please put them in the chat. You can either direct them to me or you can direct them to everyone, and we'll try to get to as many of the questions as possible. And thank you again so much for joining us. And Bill, take it away.
Wow, thanks so much for that. I really have no idea where you got all that information. It's making it a little spooky to me, to tell you the truth, especially with the stuff in people's attics. But anyway, that's great. And thanks to the class officers for inviting me to reflect a bit on my career with global health collaboration. Although with the most kind of intentions on their part, they neglected to give me any parameters for the talk. It's actually a situation I find myself in from time to time over the years, and though the blank canvas may sound appealing, it's actually a bit troubling because I don't really know where to begin. That it's troubling to try to talk about this because I'm really global health. I suppose one of the reasons I've had this 4 decades long love-hate relationship with it is it incorporates dilemmas of philosophy, ethics, diverse cultures, financial and other resource constraints, all in the context of seemingly limitless needs. It seems on some level as though it would have been just as easy to ask me to speak about the meaning of life. So the meaning of life, well, perhaps my first and reflex response is my most honest, which is, how the hell should I know? But recognizing that's not a very sophisticated response, it prods one to keep looking. So here's a slide that should resonate with this gang, because I use it from time to time when I'm trying to come up with some sort of simple word for a complex problem. And I relate that the college where I graduated from, which is also the college that you graduated from, used to screen the movie The Graduate during senior week. I would imagine they don't do that anymore. But the 1967 film depicts the confused journey of Benjamin Braddock, played by a very young Dustin Hoffman, as he mulls about his California home the summer following his own graduation, looking for answers to life and love. Indeed, at some level, looking for answers for the meaning of life. In one of the most famous, infamous scenes of the movie, Benjamin's confronted by a colleague of his father's who is really just trying to, offer some words of advice, Mr. Barney. And he comes over and he corners Benjamin. He says, Benjamin, I've just got one word to say to you. Oh, no. We're back at it again.
But plastics.
Yeah, it is plastics, but I'm not able to go forward anymore.
How about those arrows, Bill? The left and right arrows?
Yeah, no, I'm trying everything.
Okay.
It was working and then it stopped. I'm sorry.
Well, I think you're going without a net, Bill.
Bill, can I just suggest
Okay,
it's
there we
Adam?
go. We'll use that one.
Right.
We'll go a different way. One word to say to you, Benjamin, one word. And then I think Peggy already said it. Are you ready? Are you listening? Yeah, plastics. Well, recognizing that I must have been listening on a subconscious level because 15 years later, I found myself as a credentialed plastic surgeon. I don't think Mr. Barney in the movie had that in mind. And as well, I'm not really sure I'd classify myself as that at this point in time. But in any case, recognizing I'm not going to come up with any sort of gimmicky word or phrase for either the meaning of life or for global health collaboration, I thought I'd share some general thoughts. During this strange time of COVID, where most of us are suffering a bit from having our wings clipped, I thought to try to combine something with a little bit of heart and a little bit of thought. Hopefully some part of it will resonate with at least some of you. And so as an outline, I propose that first I'll read a story, and then I'll tell a few more. And then I'll ask some questions. And then I'll try, feebly, to answer some. And finally, if I'm lucky, or more to the point, if you're lucky, leave them laughing. Probably not, but hopefully at least with a smile. And I will give one small warning that my friend Judy Woodward always gives on the PBS NewsHour. Some of these photos may be a little alarming. There aren't very many of them, but it's hard to talk about 30 years of working as a trauma surgeon in war areas without a little bit of blood. Anyway, the story I choose to read is an edited version of one I wrote at the end of 2004 called Christmas in Cambodia. When I left my position at Children's Hospital Oakland in 2003, I'd already done 5 or 6 years working in the international arena. But my departure from California really represented a new chapter for me, returning full-time to my interest in global health. So I thought to write once or twice a year to friends and family just to give them a little bit broader view of the experience. Turns out, as Peggy said, I did end up compiling a bunch of those into a book, mostly as a marketing ploy to help try to raise a little bit of funds for that foundation that I started with a bunch of friends, some of whom are on this call, where we give grants to small grassroots organizations in health and education fields in many of the places I've worked. I'm not really sure how much the book has helped with that marketing ploy, and the Booker Prize has never had me on the phone, but there you go. Anyway, with that as a prolonged introduction, as a means for setting the mood, I read you a version of one of the letters. I remind that this was in fact written in 2004, although many of the themes remain the same, but not to worry. We'll catch up both with Cambodia and global health soon enough. And so, Christmas in Cambodia. It looks as though I will be spending Christmas in Cambodia this year, 20 years since I first journeyed to this part of the world to do medical work. Actually, I only spent Christmas Eve of 1984 in Cambodia, working as a newly trained doctor in the Nong Samet refugee camp located just inside of Cambodia, along the border with Thailand. Camp was intended to serve as a safe haven for the hundreds of thousands who had flocked to the border following the genocide of Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge years in Cambodia. Before that notorious regime was ousted by the neighboring Vietnamese, who then selected the new government that was to control the country. Christmas Day itself of 1984, I spent in a dusty field on the Thai side of the border, surrounded by rolls of blue plastic in order to construct an emergency hospital. Nong Samet was attacked in the early morning hours of the 25th of December by that same Vietnamese-supported regime as part of a plan to remove the refugee problem from within Cambodia. I remember standing in the hot sun that day as small clusters of terrified Cambodians, among the people I had befriended and worked with during my time in Nong Samet, made their dangerous escape from the advancing tanks and troops. In the midst of the dust, gunfire, explosions, and tears, I recall that the Christmas of 1984 would not soon be forgotten. And I suppose it has not been, although I've come to think that my biggest contribution to that day was to simply be a warm body and familiar face, serving to greet my desperate colleagues and the other camp inhabitants. I remember one such colleague, a nurse at the camp hospital, who had missed her chance to leave Phnom Penh just days before the Khmer Rouge arrived, and had thus suffered through the horror years of the genocide. As a single mother, she was strong and determined to find a better life for her daughter. I remember the tearful greeting as she arrived to the evacuation site, her daughter clutching to her back, their few life possessions folded into a cloth which Bopavang carried. Her face tear-stained and exhausted, she collapsed by me, sitting there for many hours until the shock of the morning began to fade. Then she stood and we spoke. I remember her asking me at one point, "Do the people in your country know about us? Do they know about our situation?" I responded that some did. I had not in any kind of meaningful way before I had journeyed to that part of the world. And then she asked something that I will never forget, not only because of the question and the setting, but because she did so with simple curiosity and not any sense of accusation. Then she queried, "Did they care?" In many ways, despite the decades of similar work, perhaps I've come to feel that my biggest contribution has been the one that I made that morning, perhaps simply but importantly, serving as some sort of symbol that the outside world was aware of their plight and had not totally forgotten them. Maybe a hospital, like a home, is after all where the heart is. The next time I spent a holiday season in Cambodia was in 1991. The Vietnamese had been pressured by the international community to leave Cambodia. The various warring factions within the country had all been signatory to the peace accord. The United Nations planned to arrive and combine a formula of $2 billion and 20,000 peacekeeping troops to bring free and fair elections to the land. I found myself arriving as a newly trained general surgeon to work in a dilapidated provincial hospital, short on the luxuries of running water and electricity. The Red Cross project was designed to try and assist, among other things, with the care of some of the more than 1,000 new patients per month whose foot happened to make an untimely meeting with a landmine. I was supposed to be in Cambodia for Christmas of that year as well, but my flight from Bangkok to Phnom Penh was canceled when I arrived at the Thai airport. Apparently, a small gathering in the Cambodian capital had become unruly. Many shots were fired, people killed, and the hotel where I was scheduled to stay that night was riddled with bullets. The peace plan was off to a shaky start. As Christmas of 2004 approaches, I find myself working in Cambodia again for these past few months. Although I'm on a short break from the hospital at the moment, I was planning to be back there in time for the Noel. We'll see what happens. The country has changed a lot in the last 20 years, but then again, not all that much. Living conditions are better, a lot better for the urban elite, very little better for the rural farmer. The hospital in Battambang, Cambodia was started in 1997 with the aim of trying to assist with costs and care for the large number of people still being affected by devastation of landmine and other assorted bomb and bullet injuries that follows 30 years of civil war. Over time, its programs have expanded to include reconstructive surgery for trauma, polio, and other infectious diseases, as well as congenital problems. Most recently, more general surgical problems have been added to the mix. As for the poor majority of Cambodia, there's still not access to even basic treatment facilities. The hospital is a busy place, and as the only clinical person of the international group here for most of my time, I've been working. The day typically consists of 10 scheduled cases, as punctuated throughout by the emergencies. As the roads have improved and bicycles have been upgraded to motorbikes, the number of serious traffic accidents is on a steep rise. Appendicitis, perforated ulcers, ectopic pregnancies, infections, as well as the complications of this country's most recent scourge, HIV/AIDS, keeps things interesting and at times exhausting. The rainy season ended several weeks ago, and people, especially the poorest people, will begin to travel off the major roads to clear a field, further into the forest in search of wood, further into landmine country. 20 years ago, when a person stepped on a landmine during their flight to the refugee camps, there was little alternative except to die. In 1991, the 5 to 10 patients each week that managed to survive to reach my small hospital had typically spent 36 hours making journey from blast to clinic. They weren't killed by the injury. They needed to drag them to Store Road, wait for a passing truck, often until the following morning as traffic did not move after dark, and then the long, bumpy ride to the hospital gate. These days, it averages closer to 6 hours between injury and arriving at the emergency room. Still, must be a long 6 hours. The evening before my holiday, a call came to the administrator's mobile phone. It would have been so much more convenient if mobile telephones had been available 20 years ago. The fleeing refugees could have dialed up for help as they lay dying during dark night in land caught between communism and democracy. The call that came to the Battambang hospital was to inform us that 3 people had been injured by an anti-personnel mine, and they were on the way. 5 hours later, the patients arrived. Landmines cause their injuries by the blast effect of the detonation, and in some cases by the shrapnel effect, either purposely incorporated into the device or by the flying natural debris surrounding its evil grave. Unfortunately, the 3 new patients had encountered a shrapnel mine. It tends to be much more messy. Also, unfortunately, the victims were 13-year-old boys. I left the hospital the following morning before I had a chance to find out the details of the accident, but I'm getting pretty good at piecing these things together. 3 boys find a landmine and decide it will be fun and possibly lucrative to dismantle it for the various pieces of explosive, detonator, casing, and other valuable assets among a community of, literally, dirt poor farmers. The leader of the group is postured in front of the device. That's the one that arrives dead. I wonder, while he still lives, if he is aware of the mobile phone call out at the village. The irony of modern technology's digital waves bouncing off a series of disks to arrive at a hospital that will only be reached after 5 agonizing hours over narrow, rutted roads. I wonder, as the life pours out of him while riding in the back of a pickup truck, the stars of the clear Cambodian night hovering above, if he feels scared or alone, or if the life just leaves him to be counted as another statistic. Finally arrives far too late to be helped because he's already dead, stone cold dead. And as there is no more to work on, attention is turned to his friends. The second boy is likely the gopher of the group. He is some distance away when the blast occurs. Scattered pieces of skin are missing, a large part of the shoulder, and unfortunately for him, a small fragment penetrates through his abdominal wall. Surgical exploration of his belly reveals only minor damage. He will live to tell his children of the misadventure. The third boy is the assistant. He is steadying the device in his right hand when it explodes. The hand is removed at the wrist by the blast, but the forearm is assaulted with bits of dirt and grass from the field, burrowing their way up toward the elbow and necessitating a short amputation stump. He also has penetration of his abdomen with injuries to his liver and bowel. But it is his skin that devastates. Fist-sized chunks are removed from foot to head, leaving large holes impregnated with dirt, stones, metal, and fragments of a rib here, a sternum there. He looks curiously as if he is wearing some sort of perverse leopard fur coat. The dark charred chunks of missing body in spotted contrast to his light olive skin. It will take most of the evening to try and clean up the horror, and then decide if the penetrating injury to his right eye means it needs to be removed immediately, or can wait until more is determined about the severe corneal injury of the left. In any event, he will be blind, or nearly so. That's if he lives. When I leave the hospital on that last morning, after operating throughout the night, his lungs are congested, struggling as he breathes 60 times a minute. There is no ventilator here to assist him. He can either make it or he can't. 60 times a minute, 1 breath every second. Try it for a while. You get tired pretty fast. The pragmatist in me realized that landmines are part of war, their misuse or misuse, the responsibility of those that deploy them. After all, landmines don't kill people. 13-year-old boys kill people, and themselves as well, apparently. 13 is a difficult age, a mischievous age. It is a dangerous age. 13. It is an unlucky number. If you multiply 13 by 3 and then subtract 1, you get the number 38, as in the 38th parallel that separates North and South Korea. Now it makes sense, or maybe not. It seems as like in these days of recognized nuclear proliferation, it might possibly take more than a few landmines to keep the hordes of the North from invading. Still, the Korean standoff is one of the arguments voiced for the continued need for the United States to include landmines as part of the armamentarium, and so not be signatory to their worldwide ban. This year, the military introduced a smart mine. Apparently, it will self-destruct. Hope it knows who is in the neighborhood when it decides to do that. The idealist in me realizes that just as an investor might analyze price to earnings ratio, or that in surgery there's an effort to evaluate the risk versus the benefit of a given procedure, that landmines, which indiscriminately kill over unpredictable timelines, that have killed and continue to kill in far greater number innocent civilians years and decades after any conflict, that surely the benefit of such a device in any given war scenario is yet greatly outbalanced by its known risk. Really, only people who are not so can put any faith in a smart mine. The dreamer in me realizes that landmines don't affect the lives of the average voter, that unidentified airline baggage seems like a much greater threat and concern to them, but that still, somehow, they would support the powerful gesture taken by the vast majority of nations of the world to ban landmines. Despite the long nights and difficult tragic days in this country, it remains a place of smiles and optimism. Each morning, the hospital garden fills with bright children's faces, wheelchair races, singing and laughter. I still have time to take an occasional run along the river, enjoy some delicious food, and meet lots of good and interesting people. For a Christmas gift this year, the pragmatist in me realizes I have no space to carry or store anything, and so couldn't use it. The idealist in me realizes that I already have the great good fortune of having a life of privilege and opportunity, having been born white, male, and in America. So I suppose that just leaves the dreamer. The 20 years that separate my first Christmas in Cambodia from this one has left me a bit more cynical and a lot more tired, but I guess I remain a dreamer. I imagine on some level during that Christmas day of 1984, standing in a hot, dusty field as the artillery exploded in the background and the world's dispossessed passed by me, that I wish for the same thing as I would wish for today. Peace on earth, goodwill toward men, and to women and children too, who need it ever the more so. The same to each of you. Merry Christmas from Cambodia. Well, so, I bet you're glad you're not on my Christmas mailing list. Well, having read a story that left off in Cambodia in 2004, now I'll tell a few that will get us up to date. I've actually spent many Christmases in Cambodia, including the last few years. Recently, I was looking to take a break from some other work, and I decided to head to Cambodia both to visit for the holidays and do some more work at that trauma hospital in Battambang. In addition to my usual reasons for traveling, I was also aware it was coming up to the 35th anniversary of that fateful Christmas stay in the Nong Samet refugee camp. So crossing over the land border from Thailand, I made my way to my friend Arlis's house in northwestern Cambodia, where she's helped support a local NGO doing health outreach for more than 25 years. During a wonderful Christmas dinner with a bunch of folks, I was asked by the mobile teams if I'd go out the next morning and see some of the more difficult patients. I've done it many times in the past and was happy to do so again on Christmas. So crossing over the land border from Thailand or into Cambodia, I ended up meeting Vin before I even had a chance to go out and see some other patients. Vin is a 20-year-old who I've known for some years now, who incurred massive burn injuries while working illegally at a factory in Thailand. Without any official papers, much less any health insurance, he was sort of unceremoniously dumped back over the border, where he proceeded to contract into literally a ball of scar tissue, family members dumping a bucket of water on him once a day as a token to good hygiene. A few years ago, I did maybe 15 operations on him in order to get him out to length and then upright and then mobilized a bit. But quite understandably, he eventually underwent surgical fatigue and he ended up leaving us, but all under good conditions. In any case, somehow the Battambang grapevine had informed him I was back in country, if so for less than 12 hours. And he managed to meet me as I was coming out of the makeshift shower in Arlis's compound, nothing but a towel wrapped around my waist. I think Vin learned long ago, you take what you can get. Anyway, he was interested in having some more work done on his hands and upper extremities to get them in a more functional position, which was happily arranged. Later, once mobilized on motorbikes, another patient visited on that Christmas day with 6-year-old Yung, a boy from the village of Swakduk, 7 kilometers from the main road and very close to the famous temple of Angkor Wat. Yung had been described by all of his team as being quite sick, with legs that were black, they presumed from some sort of traditional poultice that had been applied. When I approached the thatched hut where Yung and his family lived, I spotted him sitting up, his back supported by old clothes, his facial swelling and pathologically pale skin already visible from a distance, and with flies swarming around his legs. And again from a distance, it was clear that Yung did not have a poultice on his legs, but that they were mummified, the product of dry gangrene. He was auto-amputating through the knees with spine necrosis up to the hips. Yung's mother said that body and facial swelling, a sign of kidney failure, had started about a week earlier, about the time he stopped making urine. She described he'd been to the hospital 2 times in the last couple of months, the first because of leg pain, the next a couple of weeks earlier when he'd been treated for meningitis. Jung's legs were necrotic, his lungs congested, and he could hear his heart murmur from across the room. At that point on Christmas Day, it didn't really matter that proper diagnosis had not previously been made. By the time I saw Jung, he lay at life's edge, indeed, in truth, beyond the edge. Jung's mother said that they considered bringing him back to hospital, but they had no money left, and he had become fitfully hysterical at the suggestion. As the previous trips had seemed a bit fruitless, they had relented to his pleas. She said he wasn't in any pain and didn't ask for anything in particular. Once again, I found myself standing in a hot field under the hot Asian sun on a Christmas day, feeling the helplessness of the aid worker. I tried to calculate any options for this 6-year-old boy with the ancient wise eyes of a soul who silently communicated to me that if we were to meet again, it would be in a different world. After some more conversation, I gave Jung's mother a bit of money, although she did not ask for any, and told her to buy him his favorite food. And then I left. After seeing some more patients in the community, I traveled back to the office where over coffee I related my morning's activities and had a chance to share with Arliss and thank her for starting my Christmas morning off on such a cheery note. And then I walked out to the main road where I flagged down a passing minivan and traveled the 60 kilometers down highway number 5 to Battambang, Cambodia's second city, arriving at the guest house that serves the international staff at the hospital, just as they were getting ready to sit down for a champagne Christmas brunch. To be topped off, said the Swiss anesthetist, by the best tasting chocolate mousse in all of Asia. Chocolate mousse, 60 kilometers. How many worlds away from Yung? And so now to some questions. How to reconcile the disparity, how to reconcile our humanity, how to reconcile the challenge that confronts all who venture out from our communities of comfort and security into a world of such inequity. From the very first time I began to do this kind of work, I would often be greeted, still am, with words of encouragement and praise from friends and colleagues, heralding my good heart, my good work, about my generosity, undoubted personal sacrifice, all the while knowing, always knowing from that first time that it doesn't feel that way. First of all, hey, and with complete honesty, there is not much personal sacrifice going on from this side of the computer screen. I get to travel when and where I want, or I used to, meet all sorts of good and interesting people, and get to practice Zen medicine free from the burdens of insurance authorizations and all the other burdens. It's a choice I made that's been met in the many benefits and aspirations for which I once wished. But this irony remains that while acknowledging at least some motivation for the positive gesture, the burden of the development work is that one confronts the unfairness of the world daily, blatantly, at times most cruelly. It's in your face. And so all good gestures aside, how to reconcile this? Well, in terms of the most profound questions, like reconciliation, I suppose, once again, my most honest and sincere response is my most immediate, which is, how the hell should I know? And I don't really say this to be flip. It's just that having considered this dilemma in many different ways, on many different days, the best I can come up with is that some questions don't have any simple or sensible answer. or at least the one that resonates with me. Perhaps that's the only conclusion I'm capable of drawing. Many might look for more spiritual answers, others still one that's more philosophical. Albert Camus, the French Algerian-born contemporary philosopher, who also happened to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in his spare time, when addressing the scenario of an overwhelming number of needy children in the world, responded that just because there are a seemingly limitless number of children in the world requiring help does not mean that we cannot help one child, concluding, if you do not do this thing, then who in the world will do this thing? Well, I'm not French, Algerian, or a philosopher, but I am a fan of cinema. Another film from our era that holds meaning for me, not necessarily for its quality, but more so because of the timing and setting of its viewing, is Star Wars, the original. The last part of medical school, I studied tropical diseases in Peru. It was an exciting but difficult time for me. Lima was in the midst of a military crackdown as a result of the growing Shining Path insurgency. It seemed unbearably hot and humid, especially for a Yankee from New England, being alone in a foreign country for the first time in any kind of extended way. And I was struggling miserably with Spanish, a language I was supposed to have a fluent control over in order to participate in the program. My ambitious and mislaid plans to wing it regarding my beginner level Spanish skills based on the bravado of my 25-year-old self was not going over very well. So one afternoon, I found myself wandering the streets of Lima a bit lonely and depressed, and I happened upon a cinema showing Star Wars in English and with functioning air conditioning. I entered the theater and luxuriated in the cool comfort and flowing words which took no effort to comprehend, watching the film 3 times back to back. And it's a long movie. The George Lucas film's pretty straightforward. The young heroes representing the nobility of the Force battle the menacing dark side of the evil empire. In the Hollywood version, the story finally allows for victory of the good guys, complete with a John Williams overture. But I suppose for me, the struggle in this real life is one that remains ongoing. Finally, there's just a decision, perhaps arbitrary, as many of the most important decisions in life are, simply to choose which side to play for. The Force, the Empire, or perhaps that galaxy of people who never really decide. And most likely it won't be about global health, but is there something outside of our own immediate sphere that might be across the street or down the road or the other side of town or the world? Something that prompts us to reach down with tired arms and aching back and pick up that old lightsaber and take a few whacks. And in so doing, contribute to the Force. And in so doing, cliche as it sounds, for most cliche is born in truth. We receive so much more in return. I guess that's all I've ever really been able to figure out about it all. Still, doesn't make spending Christmas morning with Young feel very warm and fuzzy. Nor, I can tell you, does it help much with the digestion of his chocolate mousse. Well, recognizing that we're now conversing as biologic seniors, unfortunately, and rather than the collegiate ones that sat on the senior fence in the spring of '79, I thought to share informally a very few general notions of lessons during my own journey. Characteristics that I really try to pretty much focus on when doing this kind of work is to keep an open mind and a low profile, which I find doesn't actually become easier with the passing of years. By my own experience working in the international arena, now in more than 60 countries and having visited more than 180, it's demonstrated that often differences in language, background, expectation, and approach can very easily lead to misunderstanding and miscommunication. One's reminded of the New York Times Magazine word puzzle, where a series of words are put out onto a page and the task put forth to punctuate them. Many of you may have seen this before, but I'll give you a moment to decide how you would do it. And where some would choose it to read, a man without a woman is nothing. Others would choose a woman without a man is nothing. So we see that with some simple inflection in our voice, in our own native language, it can lead to diametrically opposed meaning. And in this case, perhaps some heated discussion. So it's likely no wonder that so often disagreement can arise out of miscommunication and misunderstanding rather than from substance. And indeed, I myself have witnessed countless times, some of which I've been a part of, where projects broke down not because of substantive issues, but because of what one could term action, approach, and communication that were lost in translation. And similarly, just as we each hold our own perspective and life experience, just as a hammer sees everything as a nail, I try to remain mindful of the possibility that perhaps what a project needs is actually not something quite different. For although a construction project often does require the need for hammers and nails, sometimes it really requires something in a quite different direction. And so I found that for myself, it's important to be wary of entrenched views. And I remain mindful for myself that one of the most appealing aspects of working with other countries and in other cultures, it provides an opportunity for broadening of views and perspective, or at least for the consideration of them. In terms of a blueprint of approach for considering efforts in my own little corner of activities, I've gradually come to the conclusion that there are three things that are needed in order to bring the goals of any kind of international medical program to fruition, particularly if it involves curative health. And those are technical capacity, resources, and governance. So when reflecting upon the indicator cascade that's so often used in development work, that inputs should lead to outputs, should lead to outcomes, should lead to impact, we should always be aware that impact is in fact the overlying goal, as I would assume would apply to many of your own endeavors. So that here in this Venn diagram, true impact is actually achieved at the center of it all. So I try to keep in mind when participating and reflecting upon my own role within a program, big or small, how to identify as best possible where my supportive activities fall in the diagram, if for no other reason than to keep perspective. For me, I've come to believe quite strongly that all three, technical capacity, resources, and governance, need to be addressed if real progress is to be made. And they're interrelated pieces of the pie among each of these important aspects. So technical capacity or support, for almost any project, there's a whole series of things, but keeping with a clinical focus. So there's a very sick child in the corner of the room. We can all tell she's very, very sick, but none of us have the clinical capacity to diagnose her. And so she dies. Second, resources. Well, we always think of money, and most cases, human resources. Health projects often require drugs, equipment, and supplies, but keeping with a clinical focus. So there's a sick child in the corner of the room. We know she's very sick and we've diagnosed her. She has severe pneumonia, but there are no antibiotics. And so she dies. And perhaps the hardest one, I use the term governance and stewardship. It may be actually frank corruption, but oftentimes it's some sort of dysfunctional balance between motivation, incentives, authority. I always smile at the word habits because I've spent a lot of time working in Afghanistan. Indeed, this is a photo of a mountain hospital in northern Afghanistan I've worked in many times. But my Afghan colleagues who, actually do tend to keep AK-47s and RPGs in their own homes are really pretty diplomatic. And they like to use the word habits. And oftentimes they'll say something to me like, Dr. William, it's actually not the habit of the on-call medical team to remain in the hospital beyond lunchtime, even though they're contracted to be there for 24 hours for emergencies. Or it's not the habit of the blood bank to keep spare units on hold in case of an emergency, even though all the pieces of that are in place. And so there's a sick child in the corner of the room. We've diagnosed her, she has severe pneumonia. And there's plenty of ampicillin around, but for one reason or another, she just doesn't get it. Maybe it's gone missing somewhere along the supply chain, maybe staff are not available during adequate hours, maybe instructions are not clear. And for that child and that family, the result, the impact, is the same in all scenarios. She dies. And it's without recourse. Understandably, the family is not especially interested in all the things that have been done, but only in the outcome. So whether on an international, national, provincial, local, or institutional level, proper stewardship is not in place for all sorts of current and historic reasons. And so like so many links of a chain, progress toward actually lifting a project to a higher level of function, of truly providing impact, is limited by the weakest link. And so for me, I try to remain aware of what role my input's playing toward overall project goals, how it fits into this important triad, technical capacity, resources, governance, and how those activities might be affecting the other links of support, positively or in some case negatively, necessary for desired outcome. Well, having had my own wings clipped during this time of COVID, it's actually inadvertently provided a chance for me to look at some of the newer initiatives that are out there that weren't really around when I started on my own journey. For all of us, the United Nations, when it first started, has been involved with this aspect of global health, beginning in 1948 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the US signed and was ratified in 1948 with 30 goals and freedoms, among them the access to basic health care. But more targeted programs include the Millennium Development Goals, which ended in 2015. 8 goals, 3 of them have healthcare aspects, and with results that, frankly, were mixed. And now there's a broader initiative, the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals and 169 targets. Many of them have health links. We'll have to see how that all works out. But in just the last really, truly handful of years, the academic world, universities and medical schools, as well as institutional global commissions, have really begun focusing on quantitative reasons for why trying to support global health initiatives makes sense, usually focusing on disability adjusted life years, and in more generic terms, among the huge amounts of collective GDP, measured in the tens of trillions of dollars, that are lost due to lack of access to basic health care, especially for the low and moderate income countries. So that over time, a compelling quantitative argument for supporting access to basic quality health services on a global level is being constructed. And at the same time, these months have also provided the opportunity to interact with and recognize with a sense of optimism that next generation is already out there, talented, committed, and keen to affect positive change. Yet still, by almost any standard, universal access to quality basic health services remains a tough nut to crack. And although these newer initiatives are encouraging, at the same time, it's apparent that the global health community has lagged significantly as compared to the global business community when it comes to creating innovative modeling and strategic implementation that provides real impact. And so what of the future and how best to engage, motivate, collaborate, and proceed? Well, perhaps sometimes the key to the future may be found in the past, including looking at our old friend Aristotle. There's that liberal arts education coming into play. The ancient Greek philosopher who was perhaps, and then some, the Malcolm Gladwell of his time, Gladwell being the guy who wrote The Tipping Point, described the pillars of rhetorical persuasion and motivation as logos, pathos, and ethos. Logos, providing a logical framework. Pathos, emotional connection and empathy. Ethos, credibility and ethical standards. For my part, I suspect that the solutions providing improved access to quality basic health services on a global level, as with most important themes of our time, will require all 3 pillars in order to move the process forward. Yes, logos, calm calculation regarding logic, data, evidence-based decision-making. Without urgent and accelerated investment in surgical scale-up, low and moderate income countries will continue to have losses in economic productivity estimated at $12.3 trillion by 2030. And yes, pathos, empathy and emotional engagement when coming to terms with children dying alone and in pain, hours from basic health services, from planted and unexploded ordnance delivered into their communities many years and decades before they were even born. And yes, ethos, including at times moral outrage, that a 6-year-old boy dies with mummified legs in a thatched hut that lies a stone's throw away from the temples of Angkor Wat, in which nearly 3 million tourists per year each pay $100 for park admission. Joseph Stalin famously said that 1 person dying of hunger is a tragedy, 1 million dying is a statistic. But Stalin was wrong. 1 million people dying of hunger is 1 million tragedies. So too for those that die from medical neglect. For me, I guess I've always viewed the goal of improving global access and quality of care as an endurance race. And perhaps on some level, it will in fact require moral outrage in order to fire up the engine, empathy and emotional engagement to put the vehicle in gear, and logical methodology to move along the road. Well, enough philosophizing about ancient Greek scholars. Time to wrap up. So in 1984, the Thai-Cambodian border was the largest relief effort of modern times, the largest since the refugee movements following World War II. It represented the Cadillac of aid service, coordinated by the United Nations. Anyone who was anyone in terms of an agency was on the Thai border. And that meant there were about 15 agencies contributing to the effort. Jump forward 20 years to 2004, where I spent a year following the Indian Ocean tsunami working in Indonesia. When I arrived in Aceh about 6 weeks after the wave had hit, I remember meeting with the government officials and hearing that since the tsunami, 363 NGOs had registered to work, 186 were medical. Jump forward again to the Haiti earthquake of 2010, there were more than 500 NGOs registered to work in Haiti before the earthquake. Another 500 plus registered in the weeks following the disaster, and many more were on the ground unofficially. And on to the Nepal earthquake of 2015, where 73 field hospitals arrived in country for potential deployment, 3 were eventually needed. And 9 to cyclone responses and all sorts of other natural disaster, refugee and emergency aid responses, as well as development and conflict zone initiatives all over Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And that's just where I've worked. So it's amazing to me that an entire industry has been born and developed over the 40 years that I've been directly involved. And of course, the good news is there seems to be substantial global goodwill and effort and intentions, if so on an intermittent basis. And indeed, one of the opportunities presented by our connected world is to harness that sincere goodwill, while at the same time, the task going forward will be to do it more effectively and with real impact. And while we can take solace in the fact that it's hard to do it all, it's also important to step up to the challenge. Just because an effort is charitable does not give it the excuse to be inefficient or ineffective. Well, despite huge challenges, for me, there remains a pervasive sense of hope that much can be accomplished. And if we can do it well, approach it in a clearly conceived manner, execute with focus on efficiency, then the world can be a better place. We can help to do this thing. And if we do not do this thing, then who in the world will do this thing? And so much like Benjamin, as he searched about him, asking questions of life and love, and despite my shameless assertions to the contrary, I do indeed leave you with one word. As it turns out, it begins with the letter P. Are you ready? Are you listening? Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure to sit on the senior fence.
Bill, I think I speak for everyone in saying bravo. I mean, again, you are such an inspiration. Yeah, if everyone went off mute, you'd hear lots of applause.
Yay.
And there's quite a few questions that have come in, as well as a few that I had in my mind as well. And I think on starting with a little bit on the mundane, and then maybe, working our way to how we solve some of the global health issues out there. I'm curious at what stage of your career, whether it be while you were at Dartmouth or in med school or doing your master's in public health, that you realized that your calling was not going to be the traditional path and that you were going to go your own route?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of was a gradual thing, and the boxes just sort of kept getting checked as I went along. I mean, the first project I ever worked on was the summer of 1980 in the Gambia, where he's somewhere there. It's the smallest world story I know. I happened to run into Chris O'Brien on the streets of Banjul, the dirt streets of Banjul, the Gambia. But, so that interest is sort of there, peaked, I think, and that's true with a lot of people of that age, whether they're in the medical profession or something else. And then it just sort of began to click. Every time I did something, I kind of got a positive reinforcement. And when I finally, after 12 years of residency training and doing a bunch of this work, I was finally a surgeon in Oakland. And I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed Oakland Children's Hospital, but it just wasn't meeting that same thing for me. So that was actually a big decision for me, because up to that time, I'd always just sort of taken a year or two, and I knew I was dropping right back into the medical mainstream. And when I left, I sort of said, you can go off and do something for maybe 2-3 years at the most. But after that, you're going to be one of these sort of crazy missionary, crazy people, and you're not going to really be able to come back. But 3 years went by, and I thought, no, this is good. I'm just going to keep doing it.
Great. I know this is not, you didn't ask me to put this plug in, but I'm going to anyway. I'm curious where the funding comes from for you to be able to travel and make ends meet. And I know the Third Monday Foundation partially is helping with some of the NGOs in those areas, but maybe explain a little bit what you and your Dartmouth buddies created, and again, how you're able to kind of make ends meet or get on airplanes, or who's helping support you here.
Yeah, so the Third Monday Foundation actually doesn't at all. The Third Monday was really, I mean, the two themes was a way to just bring another dimension to a very good friendship that was mostly from Dartmouth days. And the second was recognizing that I was kind of out and about it to give, good and close friends sort of a opportunity to share a bit with, the kind of things I was running into. So the NGOs, or some of the people that run the NGOs are friends, but they're not, none of them have to do with my direct work. So most of that has been this whole combination. Most of the large NGOs get almost all of their funding from the large donors. So it's very much at the will of what the political winds are in any country, whether it's USAID here or the European Union or AusAid or any of these places. And that's a bit of a problem because they're always trying to feed the beast. They're always trying to run around. In many ways, what happens is you end up trying to seek where there are grants rather than develop your own sort of strong programming. An organization that stands outside of that little bit is Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, because when they won the Nobel Peace Prize, they have huge amounts of private donations. So they generally try to bring 60% of their own funding to any project. So they don't get cornered as much by sort of the focus and the motivations of the large donors. And then over the years, once in a while, I'll get some other sort of small grant, but mostly it's that. And, I made enough money when I was a surgeon in Oakland that I didn't have money to retire, but it's because I was never married with a family. I was supposed to just sort of put that aside and not touch it, and it would cook. But then 2008 came along, and I can remember I was out in the middle of nowhere in Indonesia. I came back and went online, and, my investment portfolio had dropped by 40%. I was like knocking on the computer. Hey, something's wrong with this computer, this information. And that was actually the first time I began to really use my master's in public health. Because unlike, in our country, so, I'm credentialed in 3 different surgical fields. So, you can make a pretty good living with that in the US, and you make a good living, but not the same kind of living with a background in public health. But it's kind of switched in the international arena. The consultants who kind of tend to get the government grants are public health people. But that turned out to be really good because it really expanded my horizon. I really, up to that point, I'd pretty much been a clinician. I was directing hospitals and things like that, but it really expanded my horizon into all sorts of various levels of, the whole spectrum of medical support, community levels, drugs, infection control measures, all of that.
Awesome. So there's been a couple of questions. One, Otho was wondering, community health workers is deployed by Last Mile, which I guess is one of the NGOs in Boston, but seems to be an increasingly important approach to addressing global health. Community health workers not only provide jobs, but they provide an opportunity to deliver health care when the trained doctors and nurses are not readily available. Curious of your thoughts of the potential of these community health workers. And I'll let you answer that one first and then go on to one that's somewhat related.
Yeah, so actually, and in fact, I've done a lot of work with community health workers, and it's sort of a generic term. Some places they're actually government positions. Very few places they're paid. A lot of times they're sort of supported a little bit with payment in kind, bicycles and things like that. And I totally agree. I mean, one of the things about technical capacity, resource, and governance is, if you look at these newer initiatives, and they're great that they're coming on board, but a lot of times they'll focus on one of them, and the community health workers are in the community, and I think the solution to providing better healthcare in the community is going to be based on those people who live in the community. And in fact, many ways, I oftentimes enjoy trying to work with nurses rather than doctors. And some of that probably is because and some of this is true in our country, you know, doctors tend to be, not always, from a margin of society that aren't going to be off out in the middle of nowhere. They're going to remain around the urban centers and that kind of thing. And again, that's one of the tough nuts to crack for trying to provide basic level of healthcare, you know, on a broader level, because just as we have in our country, you know, at any given time, you can look for, you know, they're looking for physicians to work on the Indian health services in rural areas. So I think community health workers are really important. Now, one of the things that happens with them is everyone who has a new idea, they say, hey, let's get the community health workers to do that. So rather than having sort of a set manageable number of things, people keep piling on new initiatives for them. So that has to be sort of worked out. And that's that's a context by context basis.
So this is just during this time of a global pandemic. I think even our own country has learned a lot of the connectivity of everyone, and also what is the US's responsibility in this current moment of sharing the vaccines we have, sharing medical skills. How are we ever going to get the world back into a place where once again people can be traveling freely? And I'm just curious your reaction, particularly since you have, been unable to do the work you would love to be doing right now because of restrictions in so many of these countries or epidemic.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, so as an example, for my work, sometimes if I have a little gap in the action and I decide, okay, I'll do something with this, master's in public health, I'll go on the UN website to look for jobs, a consultancy job. And 15 months ago, if you did that, if you clicked on health consultancy like that, there'd be maybe 350 positions. Not all that would apply for me, but they're out there. And since this all started, you never see more than 30 out there, and they're pretty they're not sort of out getting things done kind of positions. So we've really taken a big hit, and Melinda Gates has been out making the rounds saying that she thinks the global health support has taken a decade-long hit from all of this. I'm not sure that's true, but it's certainly stopped in its tracks, both because people can't move and because of the funding stream. So it's for sure a big hit. And I don't know what, it's not going to happen. It's not going to start up again at the end of the summer. I don't think I have any special insight into when this all sort of goes. But I will say that, one of the things that's clear is that it's really pointed out the inequalities and some of the weaknesses on the global level. You take a country like India, you can see how, very easily, they're not being overwhelmed. They don't have enough MRI machines and they don't have enough oxygen, right? And as some of the people in the call know, I've spent the big chunk of the last 40 years working overseas. So my personal emails are about half from the US and about half overseas. And I started a hospital in Nepal in '97, and I'm still very involved with that community and that. And they're so scared right now. They know that this is a stone's throw away from Kathmandu. And one of my good friends there, he just wrote me a note that, his nephew, I've known since he was 3 years old, is now in the hospital quite sick with COVID. And that, we talk about things get miscommunicated with language, but sometimes, because they're always talking with me in English, particularly on email, because even some of these languages I speak, I don't write very well. And he ended up the note this morning saying, what was it he said? He said, right now we just have to keep alive. We'll be able to do other things later. And it was, it brought a tear to my eye because they are so scared right now. And so what is the goal of the US? Well, I think it's whatever the people of the US want it to be, on some level, we decide whether we think we're part of a global community or we're not, So, and then it's not really for me to say how much of that we want to partake in, but I obviously think we should be part of a global community. I think it's pretty clear at this point, right? So.
Well, and for everything you've seen, our own country has really struggled with its healthcare, and certainly huge inequities within our own country. Is there any lessons you've learned that, perhaps some people in Washington should be listening to?
Yeah, that's a really tough one because it's so complex. Many of you might know Amazon, JP Morgan, and Berkshire Hathaway, the big was they put together Haven, it was gonna be a think tank, a Tulga Wandi who wrote Complications, and he was the CEO, and they were going to come up with all these ideas, and it disbanded about three months ago after 2.5 years of not really putting anything out. So this is a really, really tough question, but PBS right now has quite a good series on comparing US to Switzerland, Australia, the UK, and one more. And I can't say it. I mean, for the people who are out there from the business community, you know about this better than I do, but we spend twice as much as the next country on healthcare. We usually are somewhere between number 10 and 20 in terms of the various metrics of where our healthcare is in terms of performance. So it seems like there's got to be a better way. And what I find personally is whenever I come back, and I've really been struggling it over these last 6 months because Peggy, the young man you sat next to at the awards ceremony, Mohammed Saeed, in fact, he was that tiny little kid with his thumbs up on one of the last slides, and this is a boy, a friend of mine. He's now living in the US. His mother died of TB when he was 5 years old. A month later, fractured his spine. He's a T7 paraplegic. When he got pressure sores, he went to that hospital in the mountain area, and his family abandoned him. And when I met him, he'd already been living there for 1.5 years. He eventually we got him to the US when he was 11, and he had all this surgery and all these other things. He's now 23 and working and going to school, but he's a spinal cord injury patient. He's got a lot of issues. He doesn't have, I've got one problem, going to go to the guru who knows how to do, this gene therapy. And it's amazing how hard it is to try to coordinate his care. And these are hospitals I trained in. We're trying to coordinate it. So I think we're kind of getting worse, not better. And somehow we're going to have to look at the big picture more, I think.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And your normal humility, your story, you just left out some really important details about the story with Muhammad, who you basically helped get to America, get him the health care he needed. And again, I think it's also a story in one of your books. So maybe if everyone goes on, it's only on Kindle, but you can all read about it in your book. But Bill, we're just going to take a couple more because I don't want to have go on too long. There's been a question here on just your feeling about the global health programs now at a lot of the academic and medical centers as well. And what are they doing well, and where do you think they could redirect and focus their efforts?
Yeah, well, I think they're great, right? So as I said, you can measure with one or at the most two hands, these kind of programs. And in fact, surgery as well. When I did a year of family practice and I went overseas for 2 years, I came back, I started to apply for surgery. And 80% of the interviews were like, what the hell are you doing applying for surgery? You don't, if you want to do this kind of stuff, go be a pediatrician or something like that. And so it's quite interesting, that finally people have sort of said, really, surgery is a part of the spectrum of healthcare. So about 30, there's about 150 medical schools and about 30 schools that, give a DO. And about 30 now have divisions of global surgery within it. And I think it's all great. Most of them are focusing on building relations with training centers overseas. And that's great also. I would say the only thing for me, and the fact that I sort of harped on it so much is, I think all three things, technical capacity, sure, they're doing that. Resources and governance have to be addressed to actually provide care to that 70% of the world who lives in a rural area and doesn't have access. So, my focus has always been sort of to be out there and doing it. But I've always had it in my back pocket, but in these times, I'm beginning to shop around a lot more, a broader, scaled up model for how to provide services in these areas where they just don't exist. And they haven't existed. Very little progress has been made in the 4 decades I've been involved.
Bill, I hope you will take time to read some of these comments. You've got a lot of admiring classmates. I think our last question, just because a number of people have touched on this, how do you how do you take care of yourself? How do you stay hopeful? How do you keep going when you've been seeing so much devastation and you know, attacks on humanity?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm very aware that, you know, you can't help other people if you're not, don't have your head above water. So that wouldn't be to say that I didn't sort of get in over my head at different times over the years. And I think that's one thing I've probably gotten better at, recognizing when I need to sort of step back, you know, and to come at it another day. So um, I just sort of keep the, you know, these simple philosophies in life that for me, you know, I'm doing something about my physical, you know, activity, about my intellectual, about my spiritual, about my personal, my kind of paying attention to these other things. And most of the time when I feel like I'm really kind of getting out of whack, it's because I'm just too focused in one area and kind of losing sight of those other things. So that's kind of how I do it.
Well, again, I think we are all just so in awe and grateful. And I know you hate hearing all of that. I also would say, I mean, Dartmouth always is very proud to say that Dartmouth people have an adventuresome spirit. And I think you take that to a degree that very few of us have ever contemplated. And we really, you know, are just, as I said, in awe. So thank you so much. And again, thank you everyone. And I know, Bill, I hope your inbox isn't too inundated, but a number of people have asked for your email address. I also think we have a number of doctors on this call who probably would love to travel with you one time and help you out if you needed some other assistance. But again, keep up the great work. You are truly an inspiration.
No, and I will say, you know, please, anyone, you know, one of the things that I'm doing is I'm sort of shopping around this model of a scale-up approach to providing, you know, level 1 hospital services. So anyone who has an interest, you know, send me a note. I'm happy to sort of share what I'm trying to share. You know, I'm looking at funders at large medical supply companies and at these academic institutions. So we'll see if it gets any traction. But anyway, it's something to do while the airports are closed.
Well, Bill, we really so much appreciate it. And Peg, you did a wonderful job. The questions are great. It's so wonderful, you know, also to see everyone's face and we're such a wonderful group of people and great class, and it's good to do this. So thank you, Bill, for taking your time for this. Everyone, again, we'd love to do more of these. So if you have an idea on interesting classmates who aren't, you know, doing the normal stuff that most of us do, you know, let me know and we'll continue this and we'll celebrate the class of '79. Thank you all. Great to see you.
All right, everyone. Thanks very much.